It is Disney Lorcana Challenge Week. We got Birmingham, we got Vegas, we got a lot of meta to catch up on over the last 2 weeks and kind of showcasing some of the decks that were successful from a few weeks ago and decks that were successful this past weekend at a tournament that I attended. So I can give you all the itty bitty details of what I saw, what I watched, and what the room was like for those decks to be successful. Not a second longer. Today we have a lot to cover, and I really want to get into last week's metagame and then the broad meta breakdown for the first month of Shimmering Skies. Let's get into it. So last weekend hosted a bunch of tournaments all over the world. Quite frankly, globally, I think the tournament reports for Disney Lorcana trading card game has been phenomenal. There have been lots and lots of reported of tournaments of 30 or more players. Players are wanting to play in these tournament settings and really just enjoy Lorcana at a competitive mindset. This is pretty great to see. As you can see here, the breakdown, Ruby Sapphire sitting at top last week, Amber Steel just behind, Amethyst Ruby coming in there. And then it really does fall off to just a couple different spread decks here of Amber Emerald, Emerald Steel, Amethyst Sapphire, Amethyst Emerald, and Amber Amethyst. Now, this has been a growing thing week to week as we have been kind of seeing this mold more and more. Ruby Sapphire started in third through the first couple of weeks. And honestly, it has just been growing and growing and growing. It has yet to like skyscrape any weekend or anything like that, but it's shown that it has been very successful and probably the most consistent top 8 deck, because I also think it's a deck that it's not being registered in high numbers. It's really being registered in small numbers, but then converting and still being very good. So when you start looking at these different graphs that we have, honestly, if you follow the meta report and you can see these weekly and weekly, you can tell that from point A to point B, Ruby Sapphire has definitely kind of walked his way up the steps, being number one. And then you have other decks like Amber Steel that have started hot, stayed hot. Amethyst Ruby has actually been the opposite. It started hot, but over the last couple of weekends, it's actually fallen further and further down the rabbit hole. So all very interesting takes and all really interesting looks of how this metagame has been molding, what has been able to come up on top, and what has really started to just like slither away. I will say that I have a lot to talk about in this particular for this metagame coming up in another video. So if you want to check out my real thoughts on the reason we are where we are in this current metagame, you should hit subscribe right now. But not further ado, let's take out some deck lists. Amber Steel has really come out in many flavors of this current metagame. We have seen Lantern be very successful. We have seen Daisy Ducks be very successful. This is now another iteration because, in all honesty, we haven't seen the Queen really be successful in this metagame. A lot of players were removing the Queen from their deck list in favor of other cards. However, the most dynamic part about this list is that it's a deck list without Cinderella. No Cinderella Ballroom Sensation, no Cinderella Stouthearted. This is just like a Cinderella-less deck, which I think is another really interesting factor here. I think within every given metagame, this deck is probably a 50-card deck. I think it's very close that you're playing most of the same songs with very minimal choice involved because of just how powerful the really good ones are. And the majority of the character core is really summed up now. But this concept of being able to fit Benja in my deck list is very interesting. Big Tinkerbell is very interesting. It's a card that we don't see too much out of Amber Steel anymore. Not having any Cinderellas is a definitive choice. We are very much relying on the shift lines from the Queen and Robin Hood to kind of conquer early songs. Ursula's great. There is Mr. Smeeves. There's no Piglets, no Lawrence. There's just a lot of choice involved here. And I really, the whole purpose of like this list and really where it's at is that if you take a moment and you go and you look at the list that we have posted on our meta reports the last few weeks, you're going to see all different variations of Amber Steel, which is very much telling me that it is undefined. There is no best Amber Steel version yet. There just isn't. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that you're going to kind of see how this deck develops in the metagame itself. So as we see the metagame grow, we're now seeing that Amber Steel has actual choice, and it's not just like a 60-card, hey, this is what we're going to do. And we saw this a bit out of last, metagame as well. So it just continued here that, hey, listen, if you're a fan of the queen, no one's telling you can't play the queen. Card still shifts on two, still plays a whole new world, still, shifts, does awesome things with combat, and challenging and things like that. So still a great card. If you want to play benches in your deck because you're afraid that like items are going to run rampant, play benches in your deck. Totally fine. Let's check out the next deck. Amethyst Sapphire has been another deck that has been coming up more and more. It has not been totally successful in conversion rates yet, but I'm also certain that it hasn't been played in high quantities. So there is a lot to take away from this deck list and kind of like understand how its play pattern is, what's doing particularly well with it. In terms of the choices here, we have the general Amethyst core with the Mana Mims, the Merlins, the Crabs, the Foxes, and of course the Rabbits. The other additions here are now Cogsworth. Cogsworth, a card that I don't see very often in Sapphire decks outside of Sapphire Wheel. But it is notable here that we are trying to do lots and lots of challenging with this deck, utilizing the Crab to its best ability. And a card like Cogsworth being just a 2/5 ward character that gives an innate resist 1 to your board can make your characters have even more staying power. A card like Madamim Elephant being a 3/7 with resist 1 would be a really annoying card to deal with, even though it's already a really annoying card to deal with. The end game here is, of course, Elsa, Spirit of Winter, and Mufasa. I think both of these cards have the ability to take over a game and flat out win it. Elsa, the fifth spirit, is another key component of this list. What I do love is that we are introducing some new cards and getting some new love in the form of Belle. Belle is a card that really, when it came out, people were very hyped about it. They were very excited to play it, but there's no good shift lines for it. It didn't really fit anywhere. It wasn't doing a whole lot for you, and it kind of just fell out of favor. But now, having a card like Elsa the Fifth Spirit being a 2/5, when Elsa comes into play, she's generally taking out something small, taking a bit of damage. Right now, I think the best case scenario is if Elsa can come out and take out a Bonsai, and then the following turn, you can follow up with a Bell, move 3 damage. I think that would be a very dangerous play if we can set those things up in that manner. But all in all, I just like the touch of this deck. I love the numbers on this deck. It's really playing into the drawing and ramp package of saying, hey, I don't need 4 of all these cards. I just need them when I need them. So therefore, I can kind of spread out my end game and really just capitalize and kind of leave my opponent guessing of what I'm ever going to be doing on a given turn towards the mid-range or the end game of, the match. Hades and Cusco, Let It Go, all phenomenal answers to cards that can be very problematic for you. And of course, the library utilizing cards like Cogsworth and Chernobog's followers, and even your Tippos, kind of just getting in there, getting an extra source of draw, really just makes this list pretty complete. I will say Aggro is this deck's worst matchup, but 4 crabs is definitely the way to go about it. I have learned in my own experience, as long as you can find a crab on turn 3, your ones, even any of your 1-drops can really start to change the favor for you, and the library can come a long way as well. It's really just about trying to survive as long as possible before you can sustain the lore that your opponent's gaining. And if you can keep them at bay at like a 13 or 14 lore, which Crab can definitely help you do, you end up being able to pull up the game in a big way thanks to both of your Elsas as closers. Sapphire Steel is another deck that has honestly fallen very far out of favor. It hasn't been very successful recently. This metagame has not really shown its worth, but every now and then we get to find a pretty good success story. And this was a top 4 of a very large Disney Lorcana tournament, which is really great. And really, more interesting part, the older cards being re-released into this metagame. Maurice is a card that really stands out. It's a card that in Chapter 1, everybody wanted it to work, but it just didn't, and it just couldn't, in all honesty. There just wasn't enough good items for it. But nowadays, Maurice has a lot of time to shine. There's a lot of ability there that can be very interesting. Sheriff of Nottingham, another card that is definitely was like very hyped during the reveal seasons for Shimmering Skies, but just has not lived up to the hype whatsoever. So it's nice to see that card come in and just be a gigantic lore gain and closer for this deck. A lot of people were trying to fit Mufasas into this deck, so you'd have Mufasas and Tamatoas, But now, just understanding that Mufasa does cost 8, does put cards back in your hand, can be a little bit more problematic for this particular deck that wants to be doing other things. The Sheriff seems like a great addition to really just close out games in general. Stitch is another one. When this card comes into play, do 2 damage to an opposing character. That is a very interesting card to be seen, especially at a deck that is so hefty on uninkables on average. To be able to fit a card like Stitch is very interesting. I'm very curious in how good this card could or could not be. The return of Beast Tragic Hero is definitely something we're seeing very favorable in lots of different steel decks. Pretty much anything that's not Amber Steel, we are seeing a return to Beast, seeing it in Sapphire Steel, seeing it in Amethyst Steel, seeing it in Emerald Steel. These are just, cards that is very good, very powerful, and keeps your momentum in the game really moving forward when your opponent cannot answer it. And specifically in a world where, Ruby players just aren't playing 3 or 4 Medusas anymore is another reason why you can kind of get away with it. Just does a lot of great things. All in all, I am a little bit skeptic about the position of Sapphire Steel in the metagame. I just generally think that it might be like the 3rd or even 4th best steel deck. So, and not to mention, I also don't think it's the best Sapphire deck. So I think that if you're a tried and true Sapphire Steel fan, you might still be very interested in it. But I do think that there are other decks that are very similar to the playstyle of this that are probably just more consistent and honestly a little more powerful as well. So I don't expect too much out of Sapphire Steel moving forward just because the innate ability of the game just having better options. This past weekend, we streamed a 6-round tournament with a cut to top 8, and all 3 rounds of that. There's 9 total rounds on the Twitch channel and the YouTube channel here. So if you're looking forward, for more things like this, definitely follow us over on Twitch and really be on the lookout here whenever you see those things. And if you're looking to break down just the single gameplay, well, the good news is we do have TFM gameplay channel now. And on that channel, we have already started rolling out games from this. I think there's already 2, maybe 3 by the time you see this video. So if you're just looking for more gameplay, it's one of the more things that we just can't honestly fit always on this channel. So we made a whole other channel for it. So TFM gameplay, definitely check them out. All in all, it was a great event. And I want to talk about some of the decks that were very successful in the event and kind of the conversations I had with players about those decks. So let's check them out. This was the first place winning deck from this past weekend. It was a 33-player tournament, 6 rounds, cut to a top 8. Tommy was first overall in the event, going into top 8, and he took that all the way to a first place finish, winning himself a D23 and a non-foil promo Rapunzel from the Disney Lorcana challenges. I think Ruby Sapphire is in an incredibly interesting position in the metagame. There are definitive choices that these decks are taking that really are kind of just that. They are choices. They are educated decisions based on a predicted metagame that may or may not work out, in all honesty. This particular list does not have T-Pos. That's fine. I do not believe that T-Po is a definitive card that you absolutely need to always play. And when understanding that this deck's strength can be very weak early on, and just needing a character with 4 strength like Gaston might be enough to really tip the tides in your favor in certain games. The other thing to note here is we're back to seeing Grandma Tala and How Far I'll Go in some numbers. In most decks, we've seen more and more of these where it's been 4 and 4, but this deck is just playing 4 and 2. Totally fine as well. Having only 3 Mauis and 3 Medusas is also a note. We have 0 baby Sisus, no humans, no embodied warriors. None of those things are happening, but we still have 4 big Sisus. So we're still saying, hey, we need the ability to play Sisu and be able to remove multiple characters from the board when necessary. And in all honesty, when you have the time to check out the finals, in the finals, Sisu was played 5 or 6 times, and it was very, very good, very, very powerful, removed multiple lines of characters from the game, and I think it really played to a dividends. But the other thing is that it's a 3 lore threat. So when you can say, in most cases, I can play my Sisu, and it's basically a one-sided Be Prepared that also has 3 lore attached to it, very powerful card. Back to 4 Maleficence is kind of the way that we're answering the more control decks. Understanding that, this deck needs to make a choice between the end game approach and the early game approach, or trying its best to find the mix of both of those things. Really, this deck only needs to survive. As long as it can survive the early onslaught and just, really manage to get through Gastons, Brawls, even Grammatala on turn 3 can really still set up this approach of like, hey, I have cards in play. I have the ability to, be active in challenging early and kind of just get to a point in the game where my opponent can't win. When you look at this list and you say, okay, once we get to the end game, we have Medusa, we have Sisu, we have Maleficent, we have 4 Brawl, we have 2 more Be Prepareds. There's plenty of options here that are great. And we also have 4 Vision of the Future to find us all of those cards. I think this is a very well designed deck. I think it's a great version of Ruby Sapphire. And again, I think it's one of many. I think if you want to play the human Sisu, that's fine. Go play in human Sisu. There's no big deal there. I think if you want to play Gaston as a uninkable option that you can shift onto your other Gaston, sure, go ahead and do that. I really think that right now with the card pull, we are finally getting to a position where we have actual choice in deck construction for any of these decks. Second place was Colin playing Emerald Amethyst. And honestly, this was one of the more fun decks to watch. I got to watch 2 of the rounds that Colin played, and I was able to hear about it because he was actually the one to beat Scott in top 8, and we were able to talk about that matchup as well. So hearing and seeing this match, this deck in general being played was very interesting. It's the first time I've really seen it up close, specifically, with the new Clarabelle and with the new Shimmering Sky stuff. And I really did like what this deck was trying to do. So let's break it down. Emerald Amethyst has been a deck that's been kind of on the upswing this metagame. In most of the lists that you're going to see, and definitely in the total breakdown, this is probably the 4th most successful deck in the metagame so far. It's still pretty far behind the top 3 in terms of success, but it does have a nice little gap between 4 and 5, kind of just saying, hey, like I'm definitely in the runnings for one of the better decks in the metagame. And this version of it is very leaning towards a bunch of new and interesting cards. We're really leaning into Shimmering Skies. It's the previous decks I've shown you have not really played that much into Shimmering Skies. They've only just been like kind of sprinkling in whatever cards may or may not be a good addition to the list. But this one's saying like, nope, I'm a Clarabelle deck. I have Mother Gothels. I have your Welcomes. I have Emerald Chromacon in this list, the library, Elsa. Like there's just so much going on that's really embodying Shimmering Skies. And I really love seeing that in the metagames early on. This deck honestly almost came back from a 19-0 deficit in against an aggro match. Lyle was incredible in this deck. Elsa also playing a huge dividend role, and Emerald Chromacon was also very interesting. However, be mindful of it, a card that can definitely be problematic for opponents. I think this list is doing a lot of very powerful things, and while it's doing that, it's being very annoying. I believe that Snake and Bonsai are incredibly well positioned in the metagame. Bonsai in specific, like, yes, it can be taken away by a Let the Storm Rage on, but in all honesty, we have 4 Ursula Deceivers, so we can definitely play them first, protect our Bonsais, and then just have a 3-strength, 2 willpower lore in play that trades with so many things. It's actually incredible that in the early goings of the metagame, this card really puts a stop to so many early threats, and in some cases might even trade out over them. Lyle is another key component of this deck. I really love that card. Right now in the metagame, this was a card that was not very favorable early on when it came out, but now in the position that aggro is really seeing play, this card's being very critical, very crucial, and it's showing up in multiple deck lists throughout the metagame. You're welcome continues to be a very interesting card to the game, but in the end, paying for or even singing with Rabbit to remove a problematic location or a problematic item, even to kind of get rid of your own card. We saw him in the top 4 actually sing with Rabbit. You're welcome his own Rabbit, draw 3 cards, and then draw the card he needed to win the game. So it has a lot of play here. It also, in some ways, adds just another version of like Friends on the other side. So this deck has the ability to keep up. There's lots of really interesting choice here. The Clarabelle is obviously very good. If anyone hasn't really played against Clarabelle yet, I think it's one of the most fun cards in Shimmering Skies. I had a blast playing it this past weekend. All in all, Colin took this to a second place finish, played very well, ended up losing a pretty tough game in game three. His deck kind of just like didn't get there, kind of fell apart a little bit, and that's just going to happen sometimes in Lorcana. But all in all, I think this deck is really good. I think it's very well positioned in the metagame. I definitely think it's a choice that you should consider for set championships or even a Disney Lorcana challenge. Amber Emerald. Aggro? Question mark? That's right. In most recent past, we've seen a lot of Amber Aggro or Amber Emerald songs lists that, are built around muses and discarding cards and Diablo and doing all those things. That is not what's going on here. Melissa was able to take this to a top 8 and be 4-2 going into the final round. Melissa was on camera a couple times, and in some of those games, this deck looked very threatening. A Daisy on 1, followed by a Lilo and a Queen on turn 2, can turn into very interesting play lines and be able to protect or even utilize a card like Daisy to take something out favorably, setting up Rapunzel down the line. The other threatening line was Daisy into a Pegasus and Lilo, and then on turn 3, we get to shift Pegasus, give all of our cards evasive, and just be really annoying. Obviously, the bodyguards here protecting your early game is very great as well. When you compare this aggro list to the Amethyst aggro list, you have to start questioning, like, okay, what is it doing for me? How am I gaining benefits? And the Clarabelle is the answer here. It's adding this very end game threat of Clarabelle. Getting to 5 ink is definitely, achievable for this list with cards like Hey Hey and things like that. It's also a very heavy inkable list. The only uninkables are Daisy, Lilo, and the Chernobog. Everything else here is inkable. Oh, I'm sorry, in blue, I missed that one. But all in all, very cheap, low to the ground deck. Getting Clarabelle is not that impossible. Having the Cricky, I think, is a really another nice little pop as a way to kind of like come back from behind if your opponent's just ignoring you. Also turning, Donald Duck or even Baloo into 3-stranded characters to take out opposing cards. Also very good. I think the list is very interesting. I do think that it might fall short in some of the more aggressive on aggressive mirrors. We have seen, some ways that like this deck might just not be good enough to close out the game. It very struggled, the watch these games, honestly, get to like 15, 16, 17 lore. And just knowing that, like, hey, I don't have Goat, I don't have Gathering Knowledge, I don't have a spell book, I don't have any of those ways to like cheat lore. There is a couple ways that you could achieve that in Amber, but it's very, it's not as consistent or powerful. So while I like what this deck can do, and on the play, I think it has a lot of like just can't lose hands. I do worry about this deck in particular on the draw and how it's winning games on the draw more often. So going into a Disney Lorcana challenge, this deck might be really close to like a 1-1 deck, and it might still kind of like really fall behind the steel decks if you don't have, opening daisies, like 2 daisies type situation. So that would be my fear here. But all in all, if you're looking for something different to go into your set championships, or even just to like play at one of your locals over the next few weeks to try out, I think this deck is very, very good going first. It needs some help going second for sure. But all in all, Melissa played really well, found herself in top 8, and congratulations to her on finishing so well in the tournament. Scott wanted to try out some Emerald Steel this past weekend. Scott and I are both very high on Clarabelle. We really like that card and what it can do in the metagame, and honestly, just how fun the card is. And this was the version that Scott played. He played Emerald Steel, and he was started 4-0 in the tournament, drew into top 8, and then lost to the Emerald Amethyst deck that we just showcased a little bit ago. This deck was pretty good, pretty fun, pretty solid. Definitely a long way to go, I would say. I think that even after playing it, kind of understanding it some more, there's definitely some numbers that we would push around and play different things. But all in all, the proof of concept is there. This deck has a lot of legs. It felt pretty good into Amber Steel, which is pretty important. It felt great into aggro decks. The real question here is how powerful this deck could be into Ruby Sapphire. I do think the Ruby Amethyst matchup is also very fine. Just a lot of too many threats for them to really deal with and contend with. And not to mention so many big body threats. Cards like, Mother Gothel and Clarabelle are very, their cards are just difficult to deal with in higher quantities while still also trying to deal with Beast, Robin Hood, and Ursula. You're basically asking your opponent on every single turn of the game, like, hey, I'm going to drop a bomb this turn, so good luck. Morph, absolutely A plus character in this deck. It's about time that we have seen Morph truly come out of its colors. But there are just so many good playable Floodborn characters in this in combination that Morph is just such a standout. And it's almost like a, man, I can't believe I have to waste my removal on Morph, or I'm just being threatened by a far greater character. Adds a ton of consistency as well, saying that on 3, I can play a Robin Hood, I can play a Beast, I can just have a backup character for my Clarabelle. And, in all honesty, there's a way that you could fit even more Floodborns into this if you so chose. And you can definitely find a way to make this deck even more expensive. All in all, really fun deck to play. Definitely needs a little bit of tuning to kind of like fish out the real power here. But a proof of concept was definitely proven, and it's definitely a fun deck to play. Would not be shocked to see Emerald Steel be successful during Set Chance season or at the upcoming Disney Lorcana challenges. All right, so let's talk about that first month breakdown of Shimmering Skies. Here we are, a look at it here. The Ruby Sapphire ended up on top by just a small margin over Amber Steel. 36 Ruby Sapphire decks, 33 Amber Steel decks, 21 Amethyst Ruby, 13 Amethyst Emerald, and then we trickle down to Amber Emerald with 8, Emerald Steel with 5, Amber Amethyst 3, Amethyst Sapphire 2, Amber Ruby 2, Amethyst Steel 2, and honestly, the list keeps going. It does trickle down even further than that. There are definitely, Sapphire Steel decks that were successful and other in combinations were successful, but a lot of them were ones. So I just in fear of making this list as big as the screen, even crazier and longer and skinnier and things like that, I wanted to be able to read and everything. So these are all the decks that have multiple lines of success. There are also a couple more that with 2 and things like that. Again, I want to keep it small. But what it's showing is diverse metagame for sure, right? There is choice here. There is options here. But there is definitely a 1A, 1B scenario going on with Ruby Sapphire and Amber Steel. And the very interesting part of that is, Ruby Sapphire is one of its better matchups is Amber Steel. So Amber Steel is still so very successful that even though Ruby Sapphire is the most successful, this deck is still getting through. So it's not like Ruby Sapphire being the most successful deck is like weaning out Amber Steel. It might be weaning it out of winning tournaments and things like that, but it's not weaning it out of top 8s. So that's definitely creating a very interesting diversity there. I will say that Ruby Amethyst started incredibly strong, and over the last few weekends have actually just kind of fallen off. Not exactly sure why. I do think that while the deck gained some interesting new cards like the library and some other choice that you can maybe make, it hasn't grown a lot. So there's a potential that one of 2 things are happening. One, people are tired of playing Ruby Amethyst and just trying out new things. Totally logical, totally possible. I'm one of those people. But the other choice here is that, maybe it's not as good as it looked early on. And early on, it was just the safe choice. It was while everyone's figuring things out, I'm just going to play this deck because I know what it does. I know how good it is. But as you had more time with the set, you're maybe learning maybe this deck's not as strong. Maybe this deck's not as good. Hard to say that any of that's true, but I think it's a combination of the both of people are just tired of playing it. Therefore, they're I want to explore these new cards. I want to explore these new decks. There is some level that I think that Ruby Amethyst, while safe and kind of consistent of what it's always doing, there's a world where it's not good enough anymore. There's a world where there are decks that do something similar to it that are maybe just a little bit better. Ruby Sapphire looks to be just a little bit better right now. And the gap that Ruby Amethyst was a guaranteed victory over Ruby Sapphire is definitely a lot smaller now. Ruby Sapphire has gotten a lot more tools that makes it a little more consistent against Ruby Amethyst. So there's a lot to be explored still. Very early on in the metagame, I do think that this weekend, the Disney Lorcana challenges will be a very large, look at saying hey, these will definitely be the most successful decks. These will definitely be the decks to look out for moving forward. So I think that this was a very good first month. I personally expect that some of these lists here that are towards the bottom will very likely flip and grow over the next 2 months. That we kind of really get into these DLC set championships. I think that a lot more information will come out and will be very interesting to kind of like go with. Speaking of that, I really wanted to touch on the deck that I played this weekend. This was the TFM Cowbell deck that I played this past weekend. It's going to be on the gameplay channel for you to check it out, or it'll be in the total stream that is still on this channel here. It was a lot of fun. I had a ton of fun playing this deck. Going into this weekend, I have been studying for an exam I'm taking soon for my job, and because of that, I haven't had a lot of time to play Disney Lorcana. I had the one day that I streamed with Dick where we played like for 4 or 5 hours, and that was a lot of fun. And then yesterday was the only other time I've really had a chance to play with new cards. I was really interested in playing Clarabelle. It's like, I want to play Clarabelle. Scott also wanted to play Clarabelle. He wanted to play Steel. Says, okay, I'll go play the Sapphire version. I just want to get games in. And this deck was so much fun. The play lines for it were so much fun. The look on my opponent's faces when I was drawing like 5 or 6 cards a turn, I mean, A+ moments in all honesty. But all in all, a lot of fun. There will be a full deck breakdown of this on the Patreon that I've been doing kind of my deck reviews for any of the decks that I played in card tournaments recently. So if you're very interested in that, you should check out our Patreon link below. You'll see a breakdown of this list. If not today, it'll be out before the DLC, along with some of my other thoughts about going in the DLC this weekend. Before every Disney Lorcana challenge, I always write an article and put it up on the Patreon for all the patrons to see, like, my thoughts on the current metagame, where it's going to be, and likely where it'll land. In most cases, I'm pretty accurate. So I do follow this data. I do this, guys, for you guys every single week. If you love this content, you like it, it's very, it's helpful for you. Hit that like button for me. If you want to see more of this, we do this weekly. It's a normal, occurrence on the channel. I love breaking down the data for you guys. So definitely check it out. Hit subscribe for me. And, if you haven't seen it, look at last week, more decks there. Honestly, going into the Disney Lorcana Challenge, I feel like it is a very wide open metagame. And while the top decks will definitely be represented well, there will be Ruby Sapphire, there will be Amber Steel. I think in a 2,000 person setting, you might see some serious spice come out and really be successful. I'm not saying that it's all going to make top 64, but, just not making top 64, still being in like the top 128, getting your Let It Go, and being like a different type of deck in the archetype might be very interesting. Ruby Emerald, is that deck going to be real? Is it going to come out and be successful? Can a deck like Emerald Sapphire be good over the course of 9 rounds? Can Amethyst Steel be good? Can Sapphire Amethyst be good? Like, there's a lot of these decks that have like showcased a bit and people have kind of hyped up. Can they deliver? We're going to find out this weekend. I'm very much looking forward to it. Of course, if you're looking to follow along with TFM, you should definitely follow us on all our socials. Instagram is normally the most active, or the Facebook page in general, for these types of weekends. I'm very excited to get with the team this weekend. I leave tomorrow morning. If you're watching this on Tuesday, I leave Wednesday morning. So I'll be in Vegas already, probably eating In-N-Out as soon as I get off the bus. So thank you guys so much for watching today. We'll catch you in the next video.